Oh yeah.
Kevin sometimes you need to be up here in front.
Hello. Yes,
When we don't know. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Miriam Knight-Gray, and I'm the Associate Director and Director of Graduate Studies here at Bristol Ireland. There's great energy around this event all week, and we're so delighted to have such a robust audience here, and we had to turn away a lot of people because we were inundated. Dan and
all my relatives.
Dan and Peter are popular guys, and I know we all can't wait to hear Dan specifically talk about this wonderful new book. I'm going to hand over now to new Director of Duxman Ireland House, Professor Kevin Kenny, who will introduce Peter Quinn, and then Peter will say nice things about Dan. And then we'll open it up then to Peter and Dan before we open up for hopefully some questions at the end. And everybody's welcome downstairs for a glass of wine after the event, and the NYU bookstore is on site to sell copies of the book. And if you're very nice to Dan, he might sign copies of it as well. So enjoy the event. Professor Kevin Kenny.
Thank you, Miriam. And welcome everyone to Glaxman Ireland House for the third event in what has been... Mike? No, Mike. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start over in that case. Welcome everyone to the third event in what has been an exceptionally rich and rewarding program so far. It's my great pleasure to introduce the novelist and historian Peter Quinn, who in turn will introduce and interview our guest this evening, Dan Barry. Most of you know Peter, of course, as he's been a central and beloved figure in Glaxman Ireland House throughout its 25 years. Nonetheless, despite Peter's protestations earlier, I will introduce him. Peter received his BA from Manhattan College and his MA in History from Fulton University. He holds an honorary doctorate from Manhattan College, awarded in 2002. In 1979, Peter was appointed to the staff of Governor Hugh Carey as chief speechwriter. He continued in that role under Governor Mario Cuomo, helping draft the governor's 1984 Democratic Convention speech and his address on religion and politics at Notre Dame University. Peter then joined Time Inc. as chief speechwriter in 1985, and it was at around that time that I first met him. And Peter was also editing the Recorder, the Journal of the American Irish Historical Society. And herein, in a little known fact, lies Peter's greatest accomplishment, for me at least. I did the research for my MA thesis at the American Irish Historical Society. Peter published the thesis in the Recorder, and the rest, as they say, is history. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Peter Quinn. When I came to know Peter, it quickly became clear that what he really wanted to be writing was novels, not speeches, or as well as speeches, but he really wanted to write novels. Peter got up at 5 every morning to write before going to the office. The result in 1994 was his debut novel, Banished Children of Eve, which won an American Book Award. Alongside novels, Peter continued to work on history, especially for television and film. He co-wrote the script for the 1987 documentary McSorley's New York, which was awarded a New York area Emmy for outstanding historical programming. He has participated as a guest commentator in several PBS documentaries, including The Irish in America, New York, a documentary film, The Life and Times of Stephen Foster, and the Academy Award-nominated film The Passion of Sister Rose. He was an advisor on Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. He helped conceive and write the 6-part documentary, The Road to the White House. Peter retired as corporate editorial director at Time Warner about 10 years ago, which allowed him to write more or less full-time. And then in an extraordinary burst of creativity over the next 6 years, he published a collection of non-fiction pieces called Looking for Jimmy. Many of you know that piece. And his trilogy of historical detective novels, Looking for Jimmy, Hour of the Cat, The Man Who Never Returned, and Dry Bones. So, Peter Quinn.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think I'll keep the ball rolling and talk about myself. And Kevin left out one thing, my youthful good looks. And I up here, and there's an old rule that Tom Kelly once told me, never mention people in the room, you should leave somebody out and they'll hate you. But I have to mention Kathleen Hill, and Colin McCann, the great Colin McCann, and Marsha Rock, great filmmaker. And if I didn't mention she we used to say in the Bronx, sue me. So I'm told we're on live stream tonight. Until recently I thought live stream was what fish lived in. And Miriam tells me this is a true fact. This is the largest online audience since the Trump inauguration. It's not larger, but it's as large. There's a lot I could say about Dan. Unfortunately for me, unfortunately for him, I was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement by Dan's lawyer, Michael Cohen. Since most of you are friends and all of us recognize his stature as one of the country's most significant journalists, there's no need for a lengthy intro. But unless you read his eloquent, moving memoir, Pull Me Up, you might not know that Dan was raised in Deer Park, Long Island, in the parish of St. Cyril and Methodius. I'm told the last year seen in Deer Park was the same year George Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn. And I'll leave it to the Jesuits and the soothsayers to explain how an Irish-Italian parish of the Great Plain of Long Island got named after two saints who invented the Cyrillic alphabet and are known as the apostles to the Slavs. Yet if the connections between Dan and Cyril and Methodius are tenuous, they are there. According to the 8th century chronicles of Anatolia, Cyril rarely smiled, and Methodius was seriously bald. I dreaded coming here tonight and mouthing trite, inadequate phrases about a book that left me amused, amazed, dazzled, and overwhelmed. But the inadequate is what I'm left with, so here it goes. This land is Odysseus channeled through Woody Guthrie. It's a road trip with Walt Whitman and Jack Kerouac and Pete Seeger and 1,000 unnamed hobo poets. It's an afternoon of McSorley's with Joseph Mitchell and Jimmy Breslin and Maya Berger. It's a journey of wonder and despair with Tom Joad and Johnny Appleseed. An eye-opening adventure across this land of Dust Bowls and Super Bowls, Badlands and Disneylands, Skid Rows and Death Rows. A sad, joyous search for our impossible dream, our American dream, our cruel, bitter, kind-hearted, ever-hopeful, never-ending pursuit of happiness. Of thee, Dan sings, of me, and you, and us, of the good, the bad, and those of us still making up our minds. Dan is a reporter in the same way Herman Melville was a travel writer, which of course Melville was, but far more an epic storyteller who pursued the great white whale of truth and harpooned the big questions about our human condition. Dan's stories are x-rays, not snapshots. They give us muscle, bone, and marrow. Dan is an essayist and stylist whose prose is on a first-name basis with poetry. A century or two hence, when historians try to figure out what saved America or damned us, this land is the book they'll turn to. Above all, Dan is the husband of Mary and the father of Nora and Grace. Behind every great writer is a long-suffering wife. Dan is the husband of Mary and the father of Nora and Grace. They're the ones who gave him the support and love that sustained him through those long days' journeys of lumpy mattresses and economy class. They're the net beneath his high-wire active cross-country chronicle. Let me end with an anecdote that I'm sure will piss off Dan. But what the hell, if you can't embarrass your friends, what's the use of being Irish? After 30 years of slaving in the salt mines of speechwriting, I thought I knew all about deadlines till I was on the phone with Dan one afternoon. He said he had to go because he was writing a deadline. I asked where he was. In Sloan Kettering, he said, finishing a round of chemotherapy. I understood then that at the heart of Dan's writing is not only a deep sympathy for underdogs and outsiders, an appreciation of the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people, and a searing indignation of the callousness of the haves and have-most, but courage. The courage it takes to report the truth, as well as find it. Courage never more important than now in this time of lies. How proud I think Cyril and Methodius would be to know that they helped spawn this mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, who, while he isn't faster than a speeding bullet or able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, has produced some of the most penetrating, moving, memorable writing in the history of American journalism. And now, Ecce Homo, from Deer Park via Maplewood, the one and only Dan Bennett. About me after he's finished. Of course.
Well done. Hard to follow.
Did you hear the bagpiping?
Yes. Yes.
That's what the inside of my brain is like all the time. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Peter. Thank you, Loretta, for this great space, and Miriam. And so what I will do is maybe read one story briefly, and then maybe Peter and I will chat about me. Refreshing. There are many stories from around the country in this book. But since we're in New York, I chose a New York story. This is about a place that no longer exists. It's sort of now like in the Brigadoon of memory. It was the Fulton Fish Market. Maybe some of you still smell it. And so this is about a woman who wandered the streets of the fish market. Her name was Annie and Gloria. The fishmen see her still, their Annie, in the hide-and-seek shadows of South Street. She's telling her dirty jokes and doing anything for a buck, hustling newspapers, untaxed cigarettes, favors, those pairs of irregular socks she'd buy cheap on Canal. She's submitting to the elements, calling out yoo-hoo to the snow and the rain and her boys. For several decades, Annie was the profane mother of the old Fulton Fish Market, that pungent Lower Manhattan place, fast becoming a mirage of memory. Making her rounds, running errands, holding her own in the blue banter, she was as much a part of this rough place as the waxed fish boxes, the forklift rocking cobblestones, and the cocktail aroma of gasoline, cigarettes, and the sea. Some ridiculed and abused her, others honored and protected her. Young men new to the market were occasionally advised to make acquaintance with Annie's prodigious breasts, kiss them for good luck. And the veterans, young men once, often slipped her $1, maybe $5, for a copy of a fresh tabloid, pay her for good luck. Young and old, they all had heard that the faded color photograph on display at Steve DeLuca's coffee truck of a striking young woman, a raven-haired knockout in a two-piece bathing suit, running barefoot against a glorious sky, was of Annie in her younger days, decades before her dark fish market terminus. But some could not see the coffee truck goddess and this bent woman at the shadow's edge, clutching the handle of the shopping cart she used to hold wares and provide balance, wearing a baseball cap, layers of sweaters and men's pants, navy blue, into which she had sewn deep, leg-long pockets to keep safe her hard-earned rolls of bills. The supposed link between pinup and bag lady sounded too much like an O. Henry tale of old New York and begged too many questions. Who are you really, Annie? How did you wind up here at the fish market, receiving your boys, their taunts, the slaps of the East River winds? Where does all your money go? What is the larger meaning of your life's arc? Never asked, never answered. Annie was just there, always as rooted to the market as the cobblestones. 5 years ago, when the city pried the 175-year-old fish market from Lower Manhattan and moved it to Hunts Point in the Bronx, Annie came with it at first. She was in her 80s by then, and she struggled to find warmth in the new market's chilled air. The men would sometimes see her in a corner, huddled against herself, sleeping. So maybe it was for the best when the city regulators at Hunts Point told Annie she could no longer hawk her bestseller, her untaxed cigarettes, an order that would have been laughable in the old market's wide-open days. Soon the raucous market chorus of curses and price calls and forklift beeps was missing the occasional punctuating yoo-hoo. Then again, maybe the market was her life's oxygen. A few weeks ago, word spread among the fishmongers. South Street Annie, also known as Shopping Cart Annie, also known as Their Annie, had died. She was 85. Her given name was Gloria Wasserman, and the larger meaning of her journey's arc was this: life is a wondrous ray. When someone dies, the rest of us cobble together old photographs, faint remembrances, and snippets of things once said to make sense of the life lived. It is folly, but it is what we do. So here is Annie, incomplete, partially hidden still in the market's eternal dusk cast by the FDR Drive. Gloria Wasserman's parents were Polish immigrants who tried to make a living as egg farmers in rural New Jersey before settling in Brooklyn. The father found work as a tailor, the mother was a homemaker. Together, they fretted over their only daughter. She was almost too beautiful, which caused her to, well, her daughter Barbara Fleck said. While working in Manhattan's jewelry district, Ms. Wasserman met an ex-soldier named Fred Fleck, who planned to bicycle to Alaska, where he would attend college on the GI Bill. He suggested that she accompany him, and she did. The front page of the September 5th, 1947 edition of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner featured an article with the headline, "Bike Hikers Reach City 83 Days Out of New York." And that photograph of Gloria in her two-piece bathing suit, movie star beautiful. During those years, and in the many that followed, Ms. Fleck had often no idea what her mother did for a living. "I don't know how you could put it nicely," said Ms. Fleck, who lives in Los Angeles, but she had a flamboyant life. At some point, Ms. Wasserman returned to New York for good, and at some point, she assumed the role of Annie and began appearing at the Fulton Fish Market, selling her wares. Exactly when is lost to time, but far enough in the past that it seemed as though she was as permanent as the skyscrapers, as permanent as the river, calling out to the late-night fishmongers and early-morning Wall Street suits. When Frank Mineo, an erudite, reflective man, joined the market in 1978, she was already a fixture. No matter the weather, he said, she was always there. What a brutal way to live. She cleaned the market's offices and locker rooms and bathrooms. She collected the men's fish clothes on Friday and had them washed and ready for Monday. She ran errands for Mr. DeLuca, known as Stevie Coffee Truck, hustling to Chinatown to pick up, some say, ginseng tea. She accepted the early morning delivery of bagels. She tried to anticipate the men's needs, towels, bandanas, candy, and had these items available for sale. If the Brooklyn Bridge could fit in her shopping cart, she would have sold it, her daughter said. Away from the market, Annie lived as Gloria Wasserman in the East Village, in a city-owned apartment building. She found joy in her family, a grandson, Travis, in California, and a granddaughter, Chelsea, in New Hampshire, but also sorrow. One of her sons died in a fire, the other, struggling with drugs, died young too, hit by a car in the East Village. All the while, Annie kept working, rarely missing a day, and gave nearly everything she had to others. Ms. Wasserman often sent as much as $4,000 a month, usually through money orders, to her relations on both coasts. She also routinely sent along boxes of used clothing that she had culled from places like the Catholic Workers' Mary House on East 3rd Street, where she was known as that rare visitor who searched for items that fit others and who had a gift for using humor and kindness to deflate the tensions arising from hardship. In 1999, Ms. Wasserman decided to retire as Annie, telling the men at the fish market that she had health problems, circulation problems in her legs, related to years of working in the wet and the cold. Joe Tuna and Stevie Coffee Truck raised $3,000 for her by hitting up all the hardened fishmongers. Off she went then to live with her daughter in California and then with Chelsea in New Hampshire. After 9 months in the country, though, Annie was back at the market, calling Yoo-Hoo and forcing Joe Tuna and Stevie Coffee Truck to do some explaining. With the money she earned by working in all weather, in the hours when the rest of us slept, Annie bought Chelsea, her granddaughter, a used Toyota Tercel. She paid for Chelsea's tuition at the University of New Hampshire and provided financial support to a ballet school in Los Angeles. Whatever money she took in, she sent out, while owning little more than a bed and a radio. Her relatives, in turn, regularly visited her in New York, where she'd always tell them, "If we see anyone, I'm Annie." About 10 years ago, Joe Tuna and Stevie Coffee Truck heard that Annie had been hospitalized. They went to New York Downtown Hospital and asked to see. Actually, they didn't know whom to ask for. Annie, they volunteered. Shopping cart Annie? Gloria Wasserman, the clerk said, and directed them to her room, where their tough Annie now seemed so vulnerable. That was the first time I ever saw her with her hair down, Joe Tuna said. You could see the remnants of a beautiful woman. Then Annie got out of the hospital and went back to work. She continued to flash her breasts, more for the shock and a laugh than for anything else. She sold her goods, ripped into those who owed her money, accepted a hot cup of coffee when offered, and slipped away now and then to read from one of the books she always carried, like a stage actress resting between scenes. She also continued her other life as Gloria Wasserman, traveling to New Hampshire to attend Chelsea's wedding in 2006. There she is in the photographs, smiling with the bride and groom, a proud, beloved grandmother. Gloria, or Annie, suffered a stroke in the brutal August heat and was admitted to Bellevue Hospital Center. She was released after a month, spent a couple of weeks in New Hampshire, and then a couple more in California with her daughter Barbara. But she refused to eat or take her medication, and she died in her sleep, 2,800 miles from the fish market. Word of Annie's death gave pause to the fishmen. Mr. Mineo reflected on that space between black and white where all of us reside. And Joe Tuna had discovered that whenever someone in a crowd calls out, "Yoo-hoo," his head jerks up and he is instantly back on South Street, amid the beds of glassine ice and the dead-eyed fish, and here she comes. The impressions and old photographs that Ms. Wasserman left behind are, in the end, only impressions and old photographs. In fact, whenever reporters, including this one, referred to her in a news story, she would always complain that they had failed to capture her essence, which may, again, be true. Thank you.
Kevin, you're going to keep time. we want to leave time for people to ask questions as opposed to us. Is this working?
Yes, yeah.
I'm going to ask some incoherent questions. I have 3 pages of questions. I was just blown away by the book. And Dan asked me not to get political in this because this is NYU. And so I vetted these with Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's looked at all these questions. The first question is, this whole project is either somebody was a sadist or insane to come up with visiting all 50 states, writing on. How did that come about? How did the idea come? It's never happened in journalism before. There's never been anything like that.
The people at the New York Times simply wanted me out of the newsroom. What happened was I was writing the About New York column, which is a great, great job. And Jim Dwyer, my friend and colleague, does it now. And so I was doing that, and I was happy in that. And then Hurricane Katrina hit, and I really felt a strong desire to bear witness. There was so much going on. If you remember, the people crammed into the Superdome, and I just needed to be there. And so I convinced my editors to send me down there, and I was there for many times over the next 6 months. And from that experience and seeing another part of our country beyond the 5 boroughs, I got a profound wanderlust. And then the idea was, over a couple of beers with some editors, to try and replicate the About New York column only on a national scale, which is madness. I mean, I thought it was a big deal to go to Staten Island, and now I'm planning trips to the Pacific Northwest and trying to file a deadline.
Did you start with the idea you're going to go to all 50 states? You knew you were going to do that?
In my mind, I figured if I was going to stay at all these Hampton Inns and eat at all these Chili's and Ruby Tuesdays, I was going to get something out of it, and that would be the claim that I had been to all 50 states. So by the second year, I had been to all 50 states, yeah.
And the process, I mean, just the story you read now about Annie, then you go to the other side, then you're in Hawaii. Who selected the story? What was the schedule like? How many, did you have a certain amount you had to produce in a certain amount of time?
Right, in the first year, we did 1 a week. So I would leave on a Monday morning with, at that time, the photographer I worked with is Angel Franco. And I would spend the weekend looking for something to write about. And usually it would be something obscure, something.
Where would you look?
I would look at websites for newspapers, but I wouldn't look at the Chicago Tribune or the Los Angeles Times. I would look for newspapers in smaller communities, and then when I would look at those websites for those smaller newspapers, I would go to the community briefs section or the news briefs section of the police blotter, and I would try to see things that I could tease out into something more universal.
And I'm just thinking like the Jeffrey Dahmer, there's so many of them are just so striking. The minister who ministered him in jail, the access that they give you, do you call them ahead of time and say you're going to do this story? Or you show up at their door, ring their bell, and say, you're talking about the first story with the woman going to Iraq, and you say you got that on Friday, you were out there on Saturday. Did she know you? I mean,
I think I had spoken to her mother, and so the story there was, that's a good example. So I don't know where we had come back from. Usually Franco and I would come back from West Virginia or Illinois or Wisconsin on a Thursday afternoon so that I could play basketball on Thursday night, but it didn't always work. And then by Saturday, I had to come up with someplace else to go. And so I was thinking about tone, making sure that not everything I wrote was sad. I'm drawn to that. I don't know if you know that about me. And so mixing the tone of the stories so that it's not always about tragedy in America, that sometimes it's about happiness or something wondrous. And then also, so not only the tone, but also the region. It would have been very, very easy to just say, I'm going to Rhode Island, over and over and over again. So there was that pressure. And so in that case, I really was looking at community briefs in Mojave Valley, Arizona, and I saw a little news brief saying there's going to be a breakfast for this 18-year-old girl woman, at the American Legion, and then a bunch of motorcyclists were going to provide a procession for her as she left the breakfast and went to Las Vegas, where she would catch a plane rather, to Fort Hood. She would join the Army because the Army had given her $35,000 for her college education. It was the only way she could go to college. And so I called up the mother on the Saturday. I called up Franco. I said, I think we got something. Because it was just a little 50 words item. And Franco, of course, said, I'm in. And I called the mother, and she said, you show up, we'll talk to you. Of course, the problem was getting there. But we did there, and we were there in time for the breakfast at the American Legion, and then we followed the motorcycle procession to Las Vegas.
And then, so you, I mean, this is just, I want to lie down and take a nap when I think I'm exhausted just hearing this process. You go out there, you get the story, and when do you have to have it written by? You have, was it every Monday the thing happened?
Right, so this...
The 52 weeks?
Yeah, so the column would appear...
This is insane.
Right.
And you're still alive?
Well, yeah, so the column would appear on the Monday. So we would travel during the week, I would try to write it, there'd be editing over the weekend, plus trying to find out where to go for the next trip, and then it would appear on Monday. By the end of the first year, though, I have to admit that I was ready to be committed, and my wife was ready to leave me, and in fact, I think she...
And she called me several times.
So the second year, I think we did it every other week. But sometimes, deadlines, news events would overtake the column, and so there'd be a tornado that would hit in Moore, Oklahoma, and so you would fly there, and you wouldn't have made a phone call to anybody. You would just land on the ground and try to find something to say about this. So.
And did you ever go somewhere and find there wasn't a story? I mean, you had to have a story, right? It's the old thing about if you don't find the story, write it. So,
well, that goes to what Jimmy Breslin said to me one time. I had gone through some I had a procedure at Sloan Kettering, and Breslin had visited me, and then he said, I'll call you tomorrow. And so the next day I had gone through the procedure. It wasn't very good news that I received. And I was, no joke, I was wandering around the city like in a fog. And Breslin called me and he said, what do you got for tomorrow? And I said, Jimmy, I thought I'd take the day off. I'm feeling a little, he goes, what? That's crazy. Look around. Look on the street. There's always something. There's always a story. Goodbye. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Jimmy. Actually, he was very sweet to me. But from that, I took that as kind of a mantra for me that you go anywhere, there is a story. You'll find a story. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety when you're flying to Alabama or Oklahoma and you don't know what it is yet. But
right.
I've learned that you will find something. I mean, you'll be a nervous wreck by the time you find it, but you will find it.
Because when I was reading the stories, I was so struck by the way you always go at it. You always find an angle that nobody else would see. And I think of that famous column that Jimmy Breslin wrote about Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah.
Where everybody was watching the funeral. He went to talk to the gravedigger in Arlington. And I was just wondering, did you, like in college, did you have journalistic models, people you read to learn how to write, or were there
I would say
writers
that the gravedigger, the Breslin column about the gravedigger, was very influential for me. Joseph Mitchell, Pete Hamill, and there were others. And plenty of fiction, and always trying to think. Steinbeck, and thinking about. If the crowd's going that way, the media scrum. If I saw Anderson Cooper over there, and I would go this way.
Well, that was in your another thing. You could have written a book about the New Orleans. I think they were the most brilliant pieces of journalism I ever read.
Thanks.
Did you ever get any negative reaction from people you wrote about? Was that part of the game?
Mostly not. No. I did when I was in Alabama one time. I was called a papist. And I was I clapped the guy in the back. I said, "Good for you." These are like papers, right?
Well, you know what papers do.
Yeah. I said, "I'm a proud papist." Thank you. But mostly no. And you know, when I write, you know, the people that I mostly write about are not public figures. They've never been interviewed. Certainly, you know, they don't read the New York Times necessarily. They may even distrust the New York Times. So what I tell them is, you know, I find some self-deprecating way to break the ice, and it's not a conceit. That's how I feel, and I tell them that their story matters, and sometimes they get that, and sometimes they eventually get it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And once they begin to tell me their story in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas, I've said this before, where if I interview you, and you know, and it's a weird dynamic, isn't it? You don't know me from Adam, and now within half an hour, I am debriefing you about everything that has ever happened to you. Because when I interview you, I want to get inside your skin. I want to know everything about you, and so I'm asking questions that may not seem of the moment to you, but they're important to me. But what you're doing is you're giving me the gift of your story, and I don't think there's anything more precious. And so then when you give me that precious story, I understand how fragile it is, and so I will go back to you, and I will make sure that all the quotes are accurate, of course, but that everything is contextual. I'm not traveling 1,200 miles to embarrass or hurt someone who isn't in the public light.
Well, that raises the question, why did you write a column about me? You know, the range of these stories is amazing. I say Dan's the only one who could turn a phone booth into a really interesting column. And if you read the book, it's there. And the variety of subjects, and then you go to the story about you witnessed an execution. I mean, it was painful to read about. What was it like to, just the details. If anybody has any doubts about the death penalty, you read this. Man commits a horrendous crime, but the punishment is horrible.
Right. I felt a strong desire to bear witness, and there were executions were in favor at that time, and so I had applied to attend one. I mean, honestly, I have no particular desire to attend an execution, but I thought it was important to do, and so finally Tennessee granted my request. And it turned out that the person who was going to be executed had a grandfather clause. So at this time, everyone was being executed through injection, right? But because his crime predated the law in Tennessee, he had the option of what had been. And the option before injection in Tennessee had been the electric chair. And he had opted for the electric chair, which I hadn't really counted on. So then you're going to write about this, and that there's an opportunity, or there's the pull to be purple about it, to really, you know, let loose with all your feelings about it. But the way I felt was it becomes more powerful if you write it almost as though it's a procedural, right? This is what happened. The curtains go up, the man is there. And it's also very biblical. You know, the man's head has been shaved. And I had met him a week before. Frankel and I had gone a week before to meet him, to know a little bit about him. And now here he was, a week later, on the other side of this glass window, and they shaved his head again. And then it's biblical where they use the sponge to wet his ankles and his head, and the water pours over his head, all to increase the conductivity. It's a horrible, sacred moment, and the way you do justice to it is you tell it flat, you tell it straight, not flat. And I think if you read the column, you'll know that I think this is abhorrent.
Right.
You think this is the worst thing that we could do.
The man shot his 4 children.
Horrible.
You read that, but then you read this. Which the other thing, you know, there's no such thing as Dan Barry prose because it varies with the subject. It seems like your writing fits the subject. It's never like just a template that goes.
I can't make up my mind.
I know, it's just, you know, with the variety of subjects that you do and the prose style that you have,
Well,
where does it come from? Were you born? I mean, were you a writer in college, or?
a bad one, yeah. You know, if I've said this to you before, I apologize, but I'm a very competitive guy, and so I know how you read the newspaper, and I know how you read the website. So let's just use the newspaper as a kind of an archaic model. There's 6 stories on the front page of the New York Times, and you're looking at it for reasons not to read those stories, okay? You're saying, I don't need to know this. Oh, I know that. I don't need to know this. Oh, this is boring. And so to me, now it's a competition. I need to get your attention. And so the subject matter, rather the tone of the piece, whether it's funny or outraged or what have you, depends on the nature of the piece, right? And so that's what I'm using. I'm using that also as a way to say, look, give me 5 seconds. And in newspaper writing, as opposed to the brilliant stuff that, say, Colin does or Kathleen does, or you do, I have 5 seconds, because you're going to bail and you're going to go and read a story written by one of my friends, and screw them. Right? Screw them. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to draw you in 5 seconds. I'm begging you, give me 5 seconds to read that first paragraph, and then if I've captured your attention briefly with wit or with imagery or something, then I'm saying, okay, give me 5 more seconds, and then hopefully within 10 or 15 seconds, you're in, and the story will have topspin drawing you in and along, and then at the end of the story, there has to be some payoff, right? Instead of the old newspaper thing with a quote. If you look at newspaper stories, they almost invariably end in a quotation, because the reporter doesn't know how to end it, and they're tired. They want to go home. They want to get to the bar, right? And so it'll say, "And a good time was had by all," he said, laughing, and that's how the story would end. So I know that that's not the way to end a story, and so I'm always thinking about the ending as well.
Well, you know, you're a great reporter, but there's also, I would think, a novelist's ability on it to take it to another level. What you do with the subject matter. And that whole thing about the first paragraph, were there times when you said, I can't find the first paragraph?
Yes, yeah, sure. And sometimes the first paragraph that you've thought about and crafted carefully winds up being the kicker. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sometimes the first, sometimes it's an opening image or something that takes 2 paragraphs, and I'm taking a risk that the reader will stay with me for that.
Now, but this is probably a stupid question, but I have the right to ask stupid questions because I have the microphone. The difference between, somebody's a reporter, somebody's a journalist. It's the Columbia School of Journalism, but you're a great reporter because you get the facts, but there's another level on top of that. What's going on? I mean, you learn the skill of a reporter. There's what I think of as newspaper writing. There are articles you read, it could have been written by anybody. Not that it's very well reported, but doesn't have that thing. So is that do you think of yourself as a journalist or a reporter? Or is there any difference? Am I just a layperson?
No, when at my first newspaper, the guy who sat next to me would laugh at colleagues who would call themselves journalists, and he was proud to be a reporter, and so I'm proud to be a reporter. And if you look at your work or at Peter's, Colin's rather, there's a lot of reporting that has gone into it, and now you've run it through your mill of imagination. I try to do almost the same thing, though I'm restricted to a certain extent. Like, everything's true, everything's factual, not necessarily true. Colin has a thing about truth and fact. We don't want to go there right now.
Let me go to a 30,000-foot question. You write in the introduction that politics really entered my mind. And then I read this incredible story about Donna's Diner, and it struck me. This column is set between 2007 and 2008, which is one of the most transformative decades in American history, right? We go from Obama.
It was 2012, Donna's Diner.
Oh, but you're writing goes on.
Sure,
this is included. This is the whole decade, which And yeah, you write the column the month before the 2012 election.
Right.
And then, so that's Obama's second term. Then you note at the end that she gave up in December 2016, a month before Trump's inaugurated. The other one was the month before Obama's reelected. And I looked up Lorain County. Obama carried Lorain County by 20,000 votes in 2016. Hillary won by 20,000 less. And you don't write about politics, but I get a sense of something going on in the country when you're covering all this stuff. And I wonder, when you were in Ohio and places like that, were you sensing a change that, you know, people didn't see that whole rush, that this was moving towards some place that would eventually vote for Trump?
I would say that, you know, I would try to lie to you and say that I saw it coming. I think I saw intimations of it and reflected that in some of my reporting, but I don't think that I put it all together. I don't think that in my wildest imagination that Donald Trump would get the nomination first of all and then would win as president. So I did see intimations of that, and I did see constant struggling, even though the economy was recovering after the recession and after the Lehman Brothers disaster and all that kind of stuff. People like Donna in cities like Elyria, it's a very small city, were struggling. We're having a hard time getting by, and many of my stories are about people trying to get by after economic or natural disaster. But I can't say that I ever in my wildest dreams thought that Trump would be president.
Well, much to your credit, I think you never used the word deplorables. Let me read you this. Filed from every one of the 50 states, this is you. These standalone dispatches also fit together jigsaw-like into an epic larger than the individual cells. But what combined were they telling me? What was the story? So, tell us.
You're asking me?
That's your words. You're on the spot.
What was the story? What did I come away with?
When you come away, you said putting this together in a larger epic. You asked yourself.
So I'm a New Yorker, and there's a lot that comes with that, right? The stereotype of being a wise ass and hard and elitist and liberal and all that kind of stuff, which isn't necessarily true, right? And so what I learned was to overcome the preconceived notions I might have about a state or a region. So if I said to you the Appalachian stretch of Kentucky, already you're thinking of, I don't know what you're thinking, Little Abner. You're thinking, right, Jersey. Right, the Pine Barrens. You have a preconceived notion. And so here's a small town in Kentucky called Vico outside of Hazard, where the mayor is gay, and the town council passed a resolution proclaiming the rights of all people, no matter no matter their race, color, creed, or sexual orientation. So that's an example of the stereotypes falling away to a certain extent, right? So, you know, if I said the Pacific Northwest, or if I said Florida, or if I said Texas to you, images or impressions come to your mind, and they're not always true. So what I found more often is a commonality. I found a willingness to help one another. So when in Missouri, the banks of the Mississippi are overflowing, it's a dangerous situation, everyone comes together, no matter the color, no matter their political affiliation, and they're sandbagging. They're even getting the inmates out of the local prison, and they're all working together to hold the river at bay. And I think that's true in a larger sense. I found a commonality, and I found a pride in country, and I found that we're all bound together by the desire to get by and to do better by our children.
So, I mean, you're the only person I know, and I think you're the only journalist in history who's written columns from 50 states. You have.
I don't know if that's true, yeah.
I can't imagine. I don't know anybody else who even attempted it.
Who would want to?
Well,
I said, who would want to?
Yeah, so just, I'll let other people ask questions, maybe.
Yes, you will.
Do you think that there's an American character? I mean, there's something we all share? I'll say this, the last thing about the book is, I haven't been optimistic about the country in a long time, but I'm very optimistic reading this book, the variety of people. And I'm just wondering, you know, is there an American character that makes you optimistic? You're talking about endurance, right?
Yeah. You know, the country's gone through phases like this before. Okay, and if you read or listen to John Meacham, for example, he's very eloquent on this issue. And so I find, no question it's fractious times now. No question that our American identity seems not so clear at the moment. But I have great faith that, you know, we come back to who we think we are as best we can. You know, one other point, you know, the idea that, you know, okay, since Trump became president, suddenly, you know, we're all, you know, there's a racism in this country, the alt-right, Charlottesville. You know what? On the night that Obama was elected president, a jubilant day in this country for the great majority, some white knuckleheads set fire to an African-American church in Springfield, Massachusetts, in retaliation, in anger. And so, all right, so that happened in America, right? And that was predating Trump. He was still doing The Apprentice or whatever the hell he was doing, right? And now, what did that pastor do? What did that bishop do? You know, he wept that night. He built that church with his own hands, literally. And what did he do? In the morning, he began to build again. And I went to it 3 years later, and it's a beautiful, glorious church. So that's what I think America is. You know, we'll get by this.
And one final, what's next for Dan? What's next for Dan Barry? Are you going to do 50 countries?
A glass of wine.
You have a big project ahead? I mean, you've done 2 amazing books, but
I'm doing a story, a long story out of Flushing, Queens, that, you know, is a part of the city that I think many of us don't even think about. The one street in Flushing, Queens.
So I will now say a few words in praise of Peter Quinn. Just kidding, Peter.
Feel free, go ahead.
What I actually want to do, obviously, is open it up to questions. I think we have a mic, yes, which we can bring around. But otherwise, just ask a question and we will repeat it at this end so everybody can hear it. Now, Dan, I think you can see sufficiently.
I can also stand up.
Yeah.
This is great.
No reception otherwise. So,
what I always do is plant questions, like my kids are there saying that was a great article.
Dan, what was the last state you visited, and was there any reason why?
I think the last place I the last place was Washington, D.C. On Inauguration Day, and I just hung around Lincoln Memorial and wrote about people's reactions from there, and then, you know, under the gaze of Lincoln and what was about to happen to us.
There's one back.
Hi.
Hey, Rachel.
You were talking about your interview style, and that you really want to get under the skin of the person you're interviewing. And I'm wondering, sort of on the flip side, are there any of these stories that have really gotten under your skin that you feel like you just haven't been able to keep coming back to you?
The execution, you don't shake that off. And I think about a young woman in Ohio named Tiffany Clay who wanted to go to college but couldn't. And she was a violinist. She was a very talented musician, and she was working at a Sonic burger place. on roller skates, you know. I think of her, and I've checked in with her fairly recently, and she wound up going to college, and she has a child, and I find comfort in hearing that. So I keep in touch with more than a few people that I have written about. Another one is a guy named Jesse Webster, who was, this blows me away, he was serving life without parole, LWOP, for a non-violent drug crime out of Chicago. He was out of the south side of Chicago, and he was a minor dealer in that neighborhood, and he got life without parole. And I visited him in prison, in federal prison, and he told me that he kept writing letters to Obama, and so did one of his friends in the same wing. And one day the announcement came that his friend had been paroled, or rather commuted, his sentence had been commuted. And Jesse Webster kept the faith. He said, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And I was sitting on the other side of a table with him, from him, and I don't know if I would have had that faith. And a few weeks before Obama left office, he commuted Jesse Webster's sentence. And the guy's amazing. He's working in his church, he's got a job, he's going to night school, and he sent me a beautiful copy of the letter that Obama had sent him, telling him that he now had his freedom. Thomas?
Following that vein, is there a story that you did that you would like to go back and revisit and do a second story that would be most interesting to you?
I'd like to go back to Donna. You know, so she had that diner for years in Elyria, Ohio. She worked her ass off and just couldn't do it, couldn't swing it, and it closed a couple of years after I was there. And I'd like to go back and see how resilient she is, because I suspect she's quite resilient, and I would draw strength from that. I would. What's going on this side of the room? Mark?
Do you have a favorite piece in the book? If I could ask you to choose among your children?
No. The one that Peter referred to about a telephone booth. Now, just imagine, this is Mark Bielik, he works at the New York Times. Just imagine going to one of your editors and saying you want to go to Pine Grove, Arkansas, because a woman fell asleep at the wheel after a long morning of preparing for a yard sale, and she had gone off the road and knocked over a standalone telephone booth. And I want to go and tell that story. And I think at that stage of the column and that stage of my career, no one really noticed what I was doing anyway. And so I think that I saw a story there in a telephone booth, in how we communicate, how we communicated with each other, how the telephone booths that you don't see anymore, really. Here was one still in Pine Grove, Arkansas, outside of a motel, and how you would close it, and it was almost like a confessional. And I talked to the guy who was repairing it, and he remembered as a child or as a young teenager stepping into that phone booth and seeing all the names carved into the side of the booth, you know, so-and-so loves so-and-so, and calling his mother to say he'd be home soon, and having his mother say she loved him. And I think that connection was powerful, but hard to explain to an editor. So I'm kind of glad I got the story in. Yes, hi.
How hard was it to get people to open up to you, to trust you? What did you do to win their trust? Did you have to, what did you have to make plain to them to win their trust?
I would walk in like this. I'm here from the New York Times. This is what I think. I think that people want to tell their story. I think people like to be reminded that they matter. Okay, and so some goofy bald guy from New York comes and says, I think you matter. It wasn't a hard sell after that, usually, and I would do it, I try to do it with respect, do you know what I mean? So, oftentimes I had really no problem sitting down with someone and having that person share their lives with me. It was a real blessing for me. So I never really encountered a problem with that, except public officials, and that's another matter. Rudy Giuliani, that's another matter. So, all right. Yes.
Another question. I was interested that you mentioned you would like read your quotes back to the subjects, because often subjects will try to misremember what they said, or I'm curious if you like recorded your conversations, and then what you did if the subject ever contested the quotes, and in fact you knew you were correct.
It depended on the situation. So if I'm talking to someone who has just had her house knocked over by a tornado in Oklahoma, and I read the quotes back, and she said, "Oh, I don't want you to put that in there about my sister or something." I'm not going to add to her pain, and it isn't that important to the story. If it's a public official, and I read back the quotes, and he or she says, "No, I want to change that," that's a longer conversation, and invariably I would deny that right, as long as the quotation, as I said earlier, is contextually accurate. I've no desire to do a gotcha with regular people who are not in the public eye normally, and often are going through some kind of trauma. But as I was saying, I'm doing something in Flushing, and there are some people I'm dealing with. They're on the record. All right, I'll just stand here awkwardly. Yes.
In this age of media glut, then, do you ever consider, and I don't mean social media stuff, I mean, do you ever consider doing your work in a different medium besides the brilliant work that you do?
Dance?
The two of you.
No,
really, I was thinking of playwriting or something like that.
No, I've thought about it, and, I flatter myself for about 20 minutes and then I wake up. No, I haven't. The New York Times is starting a television news show, weekly, in a few months, and I'll be helping them try to figure out the crafting of the stories they're about to tell. That's a different medium for me. It's scary, actually, but
Are you going to be on the air?
no. They want good ratings. They want good ratings, Kate. They don't want. So.
Bert and Harry Peel's
Right,
everything
right.
in between.
All right.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Going to all these places, logistically, what was the most difficult place to get to and why?
I think it was Long Island. You're on the belt. Right? You're on the belt, and you can't get past. No, probably Akachak, Alaska. So you would. I was in a town. I wasn't in Anchorage. I was in Bethel, right? And so then from Bethel to get to Akachak, you had to take a little plane. And I was traveling with Franco, and he's a large guy, and they made him sit on one side of the plane and put all the luggage on the other side. And so they dropped us off in Akachak, which is a Yupik village, and it was a wonderful story, and they were very receptive to us. But then you never knew when the plane was going to come back for you. And so he and I were on the airstrip for about 2 hours waiting, hoping for a plane to come, but it finally did come. So,
I think we're time for one last question. Yeah.
At the risk of sounding like the most cynical person in the world, or at least in the room, did any of the people that you opened up their stories and everything like that get scammed as a result?
Scammed by whom?
Somebody reads the story and say, "Oh, there's a person," and I did. How? I mean, I couldn't figure out a scam, but there are people in the world who can figure out a scam.
In other words,
for every
once they
person.
became public, were they taken advantage of as a result of being in the New York Times?
Yeah.
No, not
Good.
No. In fact, the opposite often would happen, where I would write about a person in dire straits, a guy in Maine who was trying to provide heating oil to people who couldn't afford heating oil in Maine in January, and I wrote about his travails and how he struggled with what to do and how many times he can go without payment and so on. And within a week, he had received $300,000 from readers around the country trying to help people with heating oil through the winter.
Dan, I just have one last question because the whole the newspaper business, will you, talking about formats, do you feel it's comfortable writing for digital if the print version doesn't exist? I talked to some media guru who said in 10 years there won't be a print edition of the Times. It'll be all online. Does that depress you?
One, I think that what Peter said, did everyone hear it? He said that within 10 years it'll be all digital. One, I think that's, John Waters is in the back shaking his head no. I think most of it will be digital, but I think the New York Times, for example, will have, for people who want to hold something, there will be like a boutique edition, and you're beginning to see that even with the New York Times now. It's smaller, but I think that's probably not going to go away. And as a matter of fact, it may be resurrected as a new art form for how it's presented. And you'll see that with some of the graphic demonstrations. Friends of mine at the New York Times do wonderful things with special sections and everything like that. And lastly, in terms of how I write, it doesn't really change how I write. I don't know whether the experience for the reader is different. I did a story about Ireland last year, and the online experience with that was off the charts. So, and the argument is, oh, it's a long story, no one will stay in the digital era, no one stays for a long story. Well, the opposite is true. It's whether the story is compelling and draws people in. They'll stay with it no matter whether it's on paper or on digital.
Well, everybody should buy this book.
Yeah. So.